welcome to my channel. Queen Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch, died on March 1603 after reigning over England for 44 years. Her death and subsequent funeral were steeped in tradition and symbolism, meant to reflect her God-given divine right to rule and her importance as a member of the Church of England. But this importance also meant that her body would be displayed for all of England to see, even in death. So when she was dead, her body wasn't allowed to rest. Instead, it was chopped up, stuffed with spice, and locked away for eternity. What happened to her body and why? Elizabeth I came to power in turbulent times. England had seen a wave of rebellions during the 1530s and 40s under King Henry VIII and his successors. By the time Elizabeth took to the throne, England was at war with France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, all while Catholics and Protestants fought for dominance within the country. Despite this, Elizabeth established a strong government that saw peace with European powers and the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. She is considered by many to be one of England's greatest monarchs. However, she never married and had no children, which led to ongoing uncertainty over who would succeed her. One of the biggest threats to her succession was her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, who had been stripped of her claim to the English throne. As a Catholic, Mary was a symbol of England's religious divisions, and Elizabeth's enemies hoped that she would be accepted as the true queen instead. After Mary escaped to England in 1568, Elizabeth imprisoned her for 19 years until finally agreeing to her execution in 1587. Throughout Elizabeth's reign, there was constant talk of invasion and assassination attempts against her, leading her to become convinced that she was living on borrowed time. Towards the end of her life, she became increasingly anxious about the possibility of dying in office. Elizabeth was aware that her death would trigger a succession crisis and knew that her chosen heir, James VI of Scotland, would struggle to take the throne without her close advisors to support him. With her counselors, she worked to shape the narrative around her own death, attempting to influence how her passing would be interpreted by her people. In the weeks before her death, Elizabeth made preparations for her funeral. Aware of her ailing health, she left instructions for her body to be treated with respect, begging that her physicians do nothing that might disfigure her remains. However, her wishes went against the standard procedure of the day, which included embalming the body to prevent it from decaying before it could be buried. And while she may have had control over some aspects of her funeral, the process of keeping her body intact was beyond her grasp. In the 16th century, embalming was not performed out of reverence or as a means of honoring the deceased. Instead, it was done purely out of necessity to prevent the horrors of decomposition during a lengthy state funeral. The entire process was a gruesome one that involved removing the organs and stuffing the body cavity with aromatic spices and materials, such as sawdust and resin, to keep the corpse from swelling and bursting. On March 24, 1603, Elizabeth's physicians began the process of embalming. They opened up her body and removed her bowels, along with any other organs that would have caused an unpleasant odor. These organs were then washed separately and placed in smaller coffins before being buried. Once they were gone, the inside of the body cavity was dried out with spices such as cinnamon, cloves, and lavender. These were meant to give the body a pleasant smell, as well as to keep the flesh from decomposing. Then the body cavity was sewn up and the whole thing was ready to be placed in a coffin. But Elizabeth's body was not the only one that needed to be dealt with. Around the same time, her half-sister, Mary I, died in November of 1558 after 5 years as queen. Like Elizabeth, Mary was also embalmed, although her remains were placed in a separate coffin and buried in the vault below the choir of Windsor Castle. Now, almost a half-century later, it was time to move Mary's remains to make room for Elizabeth. On April, Mary's coffin was disinterred and moved to the Abbey, where Elizabeth's own casket would soon follow. Both sisters were prepared for burial in the same way, with their bodies being washed, drained of blood and stuffed with aromatic spices. The next day, they were each dressed in elaborate garments and placed in lead-lined coffins. Mary's was covered in black velvet and adorned with a golden crown, while Elizabeth's was more lavish, made from crimson velvet and embroidered with Tudor roses. Each coffin weighed about 400 pounds. The plan was for the sisters to rest together in the vault below the choir of Windsor Castle, as Mary had originally been interred there. However, the timing of their burials did not go as planned. While moving Mary's coffin to the Abbey, it was damaged, forcing the remains to be temporarily stored in a vault underneath the Abbey. Then Elizabeth's coffin arrived and had to be placed in the same vault until it could be moved to Windsor. This delay lasted nearly 2 months and led to a much different arrangement for the sisters' burials than originally planned. Finally, on June 1603, Elizabeth's coffin was brought to Westminster Hall and placed upon a cot. From here, it was carried in procession to Westminster Abbey. This event was widely publicized and drew huge crowds. Everyone wanted to get a last glimpse of their beloved queen. Some even reported seeing Elizabeth's ghost among the crowd. As the coffin passed through London, it was carried on the shoulders of 8 men. At night, 4 more men joined them, bringing the total number of pallbearers to 12. They walked slowly behind the coffin, which was mounted on a sled, and draped with black cloth. Bells tolled every 15 minutes, casting long shadows on the faces of the mourners. Despite the somber mood, many believed that the coffin was giving off a strange and unpleasant odor. According to one account, the air grew so thick that it could be cut with a knife. When the coffin reached the abbey, it was placed on a raised platform and surrounded by lighted tapers. All the while, the air grew heavier, and the sound of muffled drums echoed throughout the hall. This set the tone for the upcoming burial. While Elizabeth's funeral was a grand affair, it was also a demonstration of the lengths to which the ruling class would go to hide the stench of death. After 3 days of lying in state, it was time to lower the coffin into the ground. On June, the coffin was carried in procession to St. Margaret's Church, located beside the abbey. Here it was placed in the chancel before being moved to the nearby vault. Finally, Elizabeth I was buried. Almost 300 years later, in 1860, Queen Victoria's interest in genealogy led her to explore the historic tombs beneath Westminster Abbey. During this investigation, Dean Arthur Stanley discovered the remains of Elizabeth I's coffin. His report from that discovery gives us our most complete picture of what happened to her body and how it was received by those who found it. He wrote, "It was perfectly dark, but we felt a very strong smell of ozone, such as one does in a lightning flash, and there was a slight rustle as if something were stirring in the vault. Upon entering the vault, he noticed that Elizabeth's coffin had completely disintegrated. The outer wood was crumbling and the velvet lining had faded and become stained. The lead coffin itself was distorted, having been forced open in several places. The lid had fallen off, leaving Elizabeth's remains exposed to the outside world once again. Dean Stanley and his team continued to unearth Elizabeth's coffin. Finding her original leaden coffin lining and the fragments of the outer box, they also discovered the remains of her half-sister Mary I, whose coffin had been placed above hers in 1605. These two powerful women, who had spent their lives vying for the throne and competing with each other, now lay side by side in death. Even though Elizabeth's coffin had decomposed, her tomb still stood tall and proud. This was due to the structure built around her coffin, which had prevented it from collapsing completely. The tomb was covered with marble and decorated with angels holding aloft her crest. However, upon further inspection, it became clear that the tomb itself was eroding. Time had taken its toll, and it wouldn't be long before the whole thing collapsed. The remains of Elizabeth I were allowed to decompose naturally, which is fitting for someone who once embodied the concept of immortality. In her lifetime, she worked hard to cultivate an image of strength, purity, and divinity as the Virgin Queen. She never married and had no children, which led many to believe that she was immune to the weaknesses and concerns of ordinary humanity. However, her time on the throne was filled with anxiety about her own death and the possibility that her body would be disfigured after her death. Her efforts to avoid this fate failed, and her remains ended up being displayed for all of England to see. So what happened to her body after her death? Well, in a sense, it returned to the earth, providing nutrients for the plants and animals around it. In another sense, her body was lost forever, leaving behind only a few scraps of bone and clothing. Yet this doesn't mean that Elizabeth is gone from our memories. She continues to live on through her legacy as one of England's greatest monarchs. Thank you for watching.